Hello, my name is Amy, and today I am going to be talking to you about a product that, if you've ever watched any English period drama, if you love cheese, particularly blue cheese, or perhaps if you've ever taken a vested interest in the trade wars between England and France over the last few centuries, you will undoubtedly have heard of. I am, of course, talking about port. So I'll start with a little bit of history about port itself. Port, as the name suggests, comes from Portugal, which is of course on the west side of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and the grapes used to grow wine for port are found in the Douro Valley, which is northeast Portugal. The Douro Valley is divided into three main regions. The Baixo Corgo, which produces some of the lightest port wines, the Cima Corgo, which is said to produce some of the best quality port wines, and the Douro Superior, which also produces very high quality wines, but the vineyards are far more sparsely planted. Now, although the vineyards can be found up in the northeast, there's very little else there. The farmers who grow the vines and manage the vines live there, but the majority of the shippers and the majority of the activity actually happens downstream, about 70 kilometers away, which is about a day and a half's boat ride away. And that's where the warehouses are, and that's where all these huge merchant shippers also set up shop. And when I say merchant shippers, I'm talking names like Dows, Taylors, Coburns, which don't sound very Portuguese. Am I right? Well, it's because originally they weren't. Now, I mentioned these trade wars between the French and the English, which have been going on for centuries. And it was in the late 17th century when tensions really reached a massive height and England decided to boycott French products and raise import prices to astronomical levels, leaving the English no other choice but to find another producer for things like wine. Portugal, an ally at that time, was only more than happy to oblige in this. So the wines that the British merchants found and began to export would leave Porto, but before they reached Britain, they would usually spoil. So what British merchants began to do was add a quantity of what at the time was what they call brandy, grape spirit, to the wines to keep them from spoiling before they reached Britain. And this is what came to be known as port, this style of wine that produced a slightly sweeter red wine. Now, by adding this grape spirit, or the technical word is actually aguardente, halfway through fermentation, it actually stops the fermentation process. So the yeast doesn't eat all the grape sugars and turn it into alcohol, and so there's more residual sugar left, and that's why port often has this slightly sweet taste to it. There are currently over 80 permitted grape varieties that can be used in the production of port, and over 29 recommended varieties. So port is very normally a blend of many different grapes, things like Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, Tinta Roriz, which is also known as Tempranillo, are just a few of the grapes that can be found in the production of red port. White port is something totally different, and white grapes are used for the production of white port. Another really interesting thing to note is that the Douro was actually officially recognised, we call it demarcated, classified as a wine region in 1756. So this really massively predates France, slightly after Chianti, which was 1716, and Tokai a little bit later, but something that not many people know. With the number and variety of grapes planted there as well in the country in general, it also makes Portugal an absolute haven for wine enthusiasts looking for something a little bit different, and also something with a little bit of extra value to it as well. Now, aside from the number of different grapes that can be used, the names of the grapes, the regulations regarding aging and labelling. There are also several different styles of port, which can be incredibly confusing to the newbie wine aficionado. So today we are just going to touch upon two of those styles, which are Ruby and Tawny ports. Both of these styles of port are bottled ready to be drunk, so they're not going to improve with age in the bottle. But we're going to begin with Ruby port. Now, Ruby port is considered the most basic style of port, and it comes in three different styles itself. Basic Ruby, Reserve Ruby, and Late Bottle Vintage, which then comes in two different styles again. Generally, it's a deeply coloured wine full of black fruits. It's inexpensive, it's simple, it has a slight sweet taste to it, and it will have been aged in an inert vessel for less than 3 years, or maximum of about 3 years. They are also stored by producers in bulk and filtered as well, so there's no need for decanting when you drink this type of port. And if a newbie to the port world asks for a glass of port, this is probably the style of port they're thinking of. It's still fiery, it's still fruit forward, fruit driven, and with that slightly sweeter, more accessible taste to it as well. Reserve Ruby would be the next category up in Ruby ports, and Reserve Ruby is essentially a premium Ruby. The grapes are better quality, it can come from one or more vineyards, it's been filtered so it doesn't need decanting, and it will have been aged for up to 5 years in a cask. It's also very, very dark fruits, but you'll notice with a Reserve Ruby, because it's slightly better quality, the alcohol will be slightly more integrated as well, so you won't get that warming burn that you can get with some of the more economical Ruby ports. Then we would move up one notch more to late bottled vintage port. Now this is port again from slightly more quality grapes, grapes from a specific vintage. It's been aged for between 4 and 6 years in wood before it's bottled, and it comes in two distinct styles. The modern style of late bottled vintage port, as I mentioned, it must be aged between 4 and 6 years. It's fined and filtered, which is important, so it means once it's bottled, it's ready for consumption and it doesn't need decanting. It should have a much richer flavour than Reserve Ruby port and slightly more of a tannic grip as well to it. It should also be far more complex in flavour than a Ruby Reserve, and it usually comes with one of these sort of cork stopper tops, so that's how you know that it's ready for consumption straight away. And on the label it must include both the vintage year, as it comes from a specific vintage, and also the year of bottling, which is very important. Now the other style is the bottle matured late bottled vintage port, which as the name suggests does improve over time in the bottle. The main differences are this one is not fined or filtered. It's still aged for 4 to 6 years in a cask, then it's put in the bottle. It's not fined or filtered, so it will need decanting, and it will improve with bottle age. It also has a driven cork, so not just one that you pop off, and it's also aged for a further 3 years in the cellar of the producer before it's released. The bottle must also include on the label the vintage date and the bottling date, and you can expect far more complexity on this one, more structure as well from the tannins. Those yeast particles that are left behind will be adding to the complexity and the flavours. Think rich black fruits, it will be softer. Anyone who enjoys port, This would be known for them, anyone who's a bit of a connoisseur already, as more of a traditional style, but that word traditional cannot go on the label. But you could certainly buy this one. It's slightly more expensive than the others, but it's a fraction of the price of a vintage port, but a similar sort of style. Now, although it contains the word vintage in the title, just to add a little more confusion to it all, it's not from a declared vintage. So although it needs to appear on the label the date of the vintage and the date of the bottling, it's not what we call a vintage port. That's something different, even though it has vintage in the title. For a vintage port to be declared, producers need to write off to the IVDP, which is the organisation which controls it all, and declare a vintage. And vintage ports are very rare. I mean, there's probably 3 per decade, so it's a totally different class of port wine that we are talking about. But LBV, matured bottle port, is a very nice alternative to a vintage port at the fraction of a price. Now, as it's always easier to understand a wine or a fortified wine when we see it and when we taste it, I have a bottle of each of Ruby and Tawny port here. And I'll just show you what the Ruby looks like so you can see. You can see that this is what we call a stopper cork. So this will typically last now, if I put it in the fridge, probably a couple of weeks maximum. I wouldn't keep it for any longer than that. These aren't port glasses, apologise, but you can see the colour of that. It's very, very dark. Yeah, there is a lot of black fruit coming off that as well. It smells rather alcoholic. And you can definitely notice the sweetness on the palate. Huge amounts of blackberry, blackcurrant, a very average, easy drinking port, if that is the style that you like. Now it is time to move on to Tawny ports. Within the Tawny category, there are 4 different types of Tawny ports. You've got basic Tawny, reserve Tawny, Tawny with an indication of age Tawny, and Kolaita Port as well, which we will delve into now. But just right from the get-go, so you can see the difference between that Ruby and the Tawny, I'm just going to show you, it's the exact same producer, so it's Dow's again, and the colour of the Tawny is just far lighter. It's a lot, but I've seen them a lot lighter than this even before, but to give you an idea, so you might just have to take my word on this one, but this is the Tawny. I mean, I can see right to the bottom of my glass. It's got slight reddish hues to it, very, very light, whereas the Ruby is this kind of, I mean, as the name suggests, very deep ruby colour. I can't see the bottom of my glass. Just really, really different. And Tawnies go even more tawny coloured, so really kind of erring on browny colours. The bit better quality you get and the older they get as well. So as I mentioned, Tawnies are generally lighter in colour, as the name suggests, browner due to the oxygen contact they are allowed to encounter. Oxidative aging, we call it. The best Tawnies, you'll be able to pick out aromas of figs and caramel and really kind of nutty flavours. They tend to be lighter in colour, and they come from the area of Portugal known as the Baixo Corgo. The name, the colour might suggest that Tawnies are aged for longer than ruby wines, but not necessarily. And in fact, they are aged, basic Tawnies at least, are aged and stored in the same way as ruby wine, so there's very big bulk storage. So basic Tawny wines are a style that is incredibly commercially viable for Portugal. They have a huge export market to places like France in particular, and that is why they continue to be made, because there are these huge export volumes demanded every year. Sometimes as well, they can add white port into Tawny ports to further adjust the colour even more and just make it even lighter. Now, for reserve tawnies, we're already jumping up the quality ladder quite a lot. These tawnies have to be aged for at least 7 years in wood before they are bottled. And they really do have much more fine aromas of fig and dried fruits. And it's far easier to recognise a high quality tawny due to its browning colour. And tawnies can also be blended from several different vintages and of course vineyards. Now we move on to the finest of all tawny ports, which is tawny port with an indication of age. Now these tawny ports have very strict labelling as well as production regulations that go along with them. So they can only have 10, 20, 30 or over 40 years written on the label. To qualify, the producer must register the stock of wine that they have available of that age in their lodge, and the wine must be consistent with the characteristics of a wine typical of that age. The age is also an average of all the grapes included in the blend rather than the youngest of the grapes. What's really important and part of the regulations is also that the year of bottling must be stated on the label because these wines do, or this port does lose its freshness once it's opened. So these are the finest of all the tawny ports. They don't throw sediment, so they don't need decanting. You get really sort of complex and intense flavours and aromas of walnuts, nuttiness in general. I mentioned dried fruits, figs, really interesting wines. Finally, we move on to Kolaita ports, which are really quite rare. They're far better known within Portugal itself. Effectively, they are vintage dated tawny ports. So wines that will have been aged in oak for around 8 years, usually more, and then straight to bottle and straight to market. It's really important that the label not only includes the vintage date, but also that the wine was aged in cask and the bottling date as well. So that is it between tawny and ruby ports. Personally, I prefer a tawny port. I prefer the kind of faded fruit elements that you get combined with the caramel elements of the tawny port. But I am partial to a late bottled vintage ruby, certainly if there's some cheese on the table. I hope this has been useful for you and encourages you to try some ports yourself.